Where I see a lot of founders stumble, they're so passionate about their business. They grew that business by doing everything themselves and with a small knit team around them. But as they start growing, it becomes so hard for them to let go of every decision that the company needs to make, and even letting go of some of the things that they enjoy doing that maybe someone else can do better than them. It's super hard for them to delegate a lot of that stuff to people who might be doing it, as good as they have been or even better, and go from there. So they end up bottlenecking their growth.
I'm Damon Lemby, and this is the Learn It All podcast, the show for leaders who know that lifelong learning is your ultimate advantage. Today, my guest is Nahed Khairallah. He's a global HR strategist, entrepreneur, and he's the founder of Organized Chaos. Over the past decade, he's helped startups grow from 7 to 9 figures, and he's helped turn HR departments from being a back office function to being a rocket fuel for business growth. In our conversation today, we dig into a bunch of topics, one of which is when founders hit a wall, it's not because of their product, it's because of their people. Nahed explains that if you really want to scale, you need to build structure around your team. We talk about why HR has to stop playing defense and start driving business. And those same HR leaders need to be looking at P&Ls, not just policies. He also shares why he sees a lot of founders who self-sabotage because they try to do it all themselves, and why investing in your people isn't an expense, it's your biggest strategic advantage. Nahed, you've worked with hundreds of startups around the world, and what is the biggest single roadblock that you see preventing them to get to 8 figures?
Well, funny I should say this out of the gate, but it's typically the founder. And let me explain why. So again, I've worked with more than 100 companies across the world. And typically when you're at the 7 to 8 figure mark, you're a successful business already, right? You have that product market fit, your financials are looking good, and you're sort of in growth mode in that case. Where I see a lot of founders stumble is, typically most founders, they're so passionate about their business. They grew that business by doing everything themselves and with a small knit team around them. But as they start growing, it becomes so hard for them to let go of every decision that the company needs to make, and even letting go of some of the things that they enjoy doing that maybe someone else can do better than them. So what I see typically is that, especially founders who are deep into the product that they sell or service that they sell in terms of designing and building it, not only the sales side of things, it's super hard for them to delegate a lot of that stuff to people who might be doing it, as good as they have been or even better, and go from there. So they end up bottlenecking their growth. A lot of times they lose opportunities because they want to remain in control somewhat. They're not as trusting with their quote unquote baby as, they want to do it themselves versus having others do it. So that is really, I would say, the biggest one I see almost every time I work with a company around that stage. Of course, to varying degrees, but for the most part, it's about the founder realizing that what got you to this point isn't going to necessarily take you beyond where you are today. What got you here won't get you there, the typical saying. So that's kind of what I see for the most part.
I love that because, I live out here in Marin, and I've got 2 friends who are fractional CROs, chief revenue officers, and we're buddies, but I kind of like coach them on the side, literally. And their biggest frustration is typically technical founders who think they have it all figured out around sales or marketing. And it's just a frustration. And they're always asking me, like, how do I get this guy or this woman to understand it's time to step back, fix your website, get a sales team going. They kind of feel like they know it all. And it's really a frustration for them. We're going to obviously talk about how you work with HR teams and everything in general, but what advice do you have for founders who are listening to kind of take a step back and be a little bit more self-aware to make these changes?
Definitely. I think for founders, they only know what they know, and you don't know what you don't know, right? I think for founders, it's very important that they recognize where their areas of strength are and recognize and be honest with themselves that they don't know everything. Because when you assume that you know everything, and typically how I've seen that happen is, as a founder, you sort of grow into that CEO role with your company, right? If you're a sole founder or, there's just a couple of founders there, someone grows into that CEO role and they kind of inherit everything that the business does, not by choice, but by circumstance. Because your business is growing to this point, you feel that you need to own everything. And they sort of fall into this trap of assuming that they have to have all the answers all the time. And they have to be right with all their decisions because they are in that position. Well, True leadership is recognizing that you don't have all the answers all the time and surrounding yourself with people who can do it better and who can help you move forward. A big trap that founders fall into is that they self-sabotage their growth and they plateau out of their own doing. Is when you stop thinking of this from the perspective of, hey, how can I leverage other people to help me grow and get to the next milestone? Because something I tell founders all the time, your ultimate goal should be to grow yourself out of a day-to-day job and really be that person who's the visionary and who focuses on the strategic direction and where you want this organization to go, as opposed to doing everything yourself. So once founders really take a step back and think of it from that lens, they start to ease up a little bit, and instead of trying to make every decision and assume that they know everything, focus on the areas, and especially technical founders, right? Technical founders, their strength is in the technical side of developing and designing the product. The other stuff isn't their area of expertise. And a lot of times, I think why they fall into that trap is because they have achieved some level of success and they assume that, hey, we have gotten this far doing things the way I kind of want to do them. It must work. So who's this person, who's coming in right now telling me that I'm doing it all wrong? But we are at 7 or 8 figures. But again, I go back to the point that a 7 or 8 figure business, if they want to stay there, that's one thing. But if they want to grow past that, it's a very different operating model that you need to work on. And that's not necessarily something that an early stage or first time founder has recognized or seen before. So they need to be open to that help.
What I hear you saying here is that a founder needs to figure out how to get out of the weeds, work on the business instead of inside the business, and realize that even if they are strong technically or even maybe in sales, there's a likely chance there's better people out there for that. And you got to bring those people in, bring in a diverse team with different perspectives, take a step back and empower those people and kind of move forward from there. And you just mentioned, first time founders, second time founders, whatever. uh, no hard numbers here, but what's your guess? For companies that are able to scale, is it typically somebody who's been at, failed a couple times and hit it on a second or third time, fourth time, or is it across the board?
No, that's a very good question. From the founders I've worked with, definitely you do see more success and faster success with those who've been through the ringer a few times, as opposed to a first-time founder. But again, I don't have like any hard data on that. But for the most part, there are some first-time founders who actually do it well because they go into it with the right mindset of, a I don't have all the answers. This is what I'm good at, and let me surround myself with people who can actually take me, over the hump to where I need to go, versus others who try to do everything themselves, or do the things that we were talking about earlier. But yes, people who have, I think founders who are like first time, second time, third time founders, either if they found success or failure, they typically have a different mindset and a different approach. You see them typically, they default to, okay, how can I leverage my areas of strength and dump everything else to other people who can do it much better than I will, and they will enjoy it, and they'll actually help me win as well, and they will win with me. So the mindset is different because they've been through that experience and they've seen how it impacts them. And especially those founders, there are some people who fail 3, 4, 5 times and they keep doing the same thing because they don't take a step back to sort of reflect on why they actually failed and what areas they were doing well versus not. But yeah, those who actually take a step back and really dissect their successes and their failures, for the most part, they tend to have that mindset shift very quickly when they go into a new venture again.
So, how about founders who have learned from their mistakes? They have changed, and they've gotten better and they've learned to delegate and not be a bottleneck, and yet, and they have a good product, and yet they're still at the seven figures numbers. How do you work with an organization like that, especially around like an HR perspective, to help them go from maybe even being like a lifestyle business into scaling where they really want to get to?
Yeah, no, I love that question. So from the HR and people side of things is where I focus on. The biggest trap from the people side of things is the workforce management and hiring specifically. Having the right amount of people and having the right people in the right roles. what I see a lot of founders do, and to take a step back here, if you look at the expenses that a business incurs today, and let's look at primarily, knowledge-based businesses, which encompasses really most of the startup and entrepreneurial ecosystem for the most part in the last, 5 to 6 years. Um, Generally speaking, your biggest expense is your people from a payroll standpoint and so forth. I mean, lowest I've seen is around 50%, and it can go up to 80, 85% if you're very, tech heavy kind of organization where there's, very high payrolls and all that kind of thing. So essentially, if you get that investment wrong, you are going to pretty much kill your startup from growing. And how does that usually take shape? And when a company is growing and they start experiencing some success, especially during the mid seven figure mark and upwards, there's a tendency to bring in more people with the assumption that if I have more hands on deck, means that my growth is going to be exponential, and the investment I'm making in people is actually going to be outweighed. It's not going to be out. It's actually going to be a fraction of the revenue that I can generate. The trap they fall into there is that when you bring in more people into a scrappy startup that doesn't have the infrastructure to bear that kind of people, it turns into chaos. And when there is chaos, there is inefficiency, and the marginal benefit you get from every additional hire actually goes down. So what ends up happening is that their expenses rise faster than their revenue rises, and they get into this vicious cycle of, okay, what do we do now? If we put out another product, right, it doesn't sell as much as expected, we lay off some people, we drop the expenses down, but that also inhibits our ability to grow. And they get into some, this kind of cycle where they're yo-yoing between that 7 to 8 figure mark and they just can't crack the code. A lot of times it's because of how they are deploying people. And even to dive deeper into that, deploying people isn't just about having the right number of people. It's about what are the roles that exist in your organization and why? What is their impact? How do they fit into this whole value chain that you are delivering to your customers? Because at the end of the day, every role you bring into the organization, from my lens, has to add some kind of value to your ability to deliver your product or service. If you're not doing it from that lens and you're just adding hands on deck just because, quote unquote, people are busy and there's just too much work to do, it doesn't really solve the problem. So generally speaking, it is that issue when it comes to workforce management and planning is really the biggest Achilles heel of getting people stuck, because they have the product, right? You don't get to 7 and 8 figures by not having a good product or service, right? Unless you do something really horrible with your next iteration and crash and burn. Typically, you have something there. So it ends up being really a people management and finance management combo.
And so what I hear you saying is a lot of times you figure like, okay, I'm at mid seven figures. The best way to get to 8 figures is to just hire a bunch of people because that's going to go exponentially or whatever, which is not the right thing to do. You're saying that you got to look at, if you're adding roles, you got to know what capabilities that they need to have and capacity. So I don't know. Do you have a framework, or do you have? How do you help founders in those types of positions?
Yeah, no, that's an amazing question. The first thing I do with founders is I have a very, very clear conversation with them to do a few things. One is to understand what is the goal that business is trying to achieve. What are you trying to get to? What are you aiming for? Because there's a big difference between a company who's telling me that, you know what, we're happy with where we are. We just want to make things a bit more nimble and efficient, right? We don't want to get to 9 figures here. We want to be more efficient. We want to increase our profitability and be a lean organization that can scale. That's one thing. If you're telling me you want to be $100 million company in 5 years, is a different story as well. Or if you're telling me that, you know what, this is a business that I want to sustain for the next 30 years and pass on to my kids at one point. There's different ways of approaching, because each one's a different goal and the way you approach it's different. But we start with that. What is your end game here? And by when do you want to reach that? Because that also plays a big part in this. So it's where do you want to get to and when do you want to get there? That's the first step. The second step is assessing the current organization from a people standpoint, from a people operations standpoint, and the whole people infrastructure to identify what are you doing today that can actually help you reach where you want to get to versus where are any gaps that we see. And the gaps typically can have many, many different permutations. It could be the way your organization is structured. It could be the span of control of your people. It could be the kinds of jobs that you have. It could be many different things. Um, so once I identify and help them identify what are these gaps, we start work. We pretty much set an action plan in place and prioritize what are the things we can do versus the things we can afford to do versus the must-haves and good-to-haves. So I usually like to approach things in a very flexible manner because there is no such thing as you have to do all these things, to get to where you want to get to. There's always the context of the business, the environment that you're in, but also prioritization, which could, in a startup, could change between 1 month and the other sometimes. So I work with them really defining what are these top level goals that we need to focus on and really set the framework and then work towards getting there. Now, how do you determine success? Because success at the end of the day has to be success of the business. So something I like working on and what I advise to founders, even if I'm doing the work for them or not, is that anything you do on the people front has to have a reflection on your organization's success and growth. Meaning, how is this helping you? Is this helping your customer acquisition cost? Is this helping your revenue per employee? Is this helping your top line and bottom line numbers? There has to be some link somewhere to show that, okay, what I'm doing on the people side is actually reflecting positively on the business. Otherwise, there is no way to determine if what you're doing is actually helping or not. It just becomes speculation.
Right. It just becomes activity. And yeah, different organizations, different founders, they have different ideas of what success looks like. I like how you share that. If you had to put it into a pie, you specifically, where do most of your customers, like maybe even from a percentage, fall into? Like, where do you spend most of your time
Yeah,
on those different types of companies?
yeah, definitely. So the lion's share of the companies I work with are in the late seven-figure mark, cracking like mid late seven-figure, early eight-figure. Typically most of them fall around, like the 8 to 25 million range. Generally speaking, the headcounts typically start looking around, 20 to 40 people in general. Um, the reason why that is the biggest bulk of organizations I work with for the most part is because that is where typically founders start thinking of the people side of things from a structural perspective, an HR function, a people function, and really because of two reasons that I've seen for the most part. One is they are overwhelmed with the amount of HR work that is popping up due to the number of people, especially if they're a remote organization or they have people in different locations. There's some baseline stuff in HR you need to do from a compliance perspective, from just the setups process that a typical founder, anyone who hasn't worked in the function, just knows nothing about, generally speaking. So that's really what gets them thinking about that first, right? Okay, we need someone to do this. The second piece is they start experiencing some people issues, be it attrition, right? Um, people culture problems. That feeling of we've hit a plateau, we don't know what to do anymore to grow beyond this point, and they know for a fact it's not their product. They have a sense, probably they can't touch it specifically and point to why that's happening from a people standpoint, but they know it has something to do with their people. They're not hiring the right people. They don't have maybe the right manager training. They don't know even if their structure is right or so forth. So that's typically when most companies come to work, with me and start to have exploratory conversations. And I enjoy those companies the most because it's mostly a greenfield operation. It's building the entire infrastructure from scratch, and you can do it in a much faster, much quicker, in a much more cost efficient way, and it yields quicker results.
You know what's interesting though is a lot of times HR and scaling are not used in the same sentence. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, HR unfortunately has a perceived poorly. They're seen as risk adverse. actually the HR is seen as a bottleneck in a lot of situations. Can we help, let's say, hopefully demystify that myth if it is a myth?
Yeah, no, I love that you make that statement because I believe part of that is true, but it's true because of HR's own doing. What do I mean by that? There's a study a couple of years ago that came out from Korn Ferry, right? And, they're one of the leading HR consultancies in the world and so forth. I think it was something like 42 or 43% of actual HR leaders say that their biggest skill gap is business acumen, right? Now take a step back and just, comprehend what they're saying. They're saying that we don't understand the business we're in, right? That I think is that is the starting point for understanding why HR is perceived that way. Because when you say you don't have business acumen, and when your peers on the executive level say you don't have the business acumen, it means that what you're doing in your function doesn't fit in well with what the business is trying to do, and you're perceived as someone who's doing busy work and work that is really not important to our success. We just can't understand why you want us to do X while we need to do Y. That is the premise for that. So I agree with that portion of the statement, is that yes, HR has a tendency to be perceived as a bottleneck and doesn't really fit hand in hand with scaling, because when you're lacking the business acumen and understanding of the business you're in, and you don't understand how the cogs fit and how your company goes from zero to delivering value to a customer, and what are the levers that you can push and pull to really make that happen and enable that, you're not going to be able to really help with scaling, nor are you going to be able to help with the business. So where my stance on this is that if you're an HR person who's not business first, then you are not ever going to deliver value. And by business first, I mean that you need to understand the business and how it functions like any other executive in the organization. So if someone tosses me a financial statement of their business without having spoken to anyone before, I can tell what's going on. I'm going to definitely have some questions about certain things, but I can tell what's going well, what's not, where is our company spending money, where are they investing, where are potential bottlenecks. And then by speaking to a few people, I can put all the puzzle pieces together. Because at the end of the day, and I'll just go back to a comment I was making the previous question, is that anything you do on the HR front, if you cannot have a visible impact on the business, you're not going to be perceived as moving the business forward. If you come and tell someone that we need to change the org structure because this role shouldn't be reporting to that role, well, it's working, who cares? But if you approach it so let me give you an actual example there, right? I was having a conversation with a CEO. This is I think around 3 years ago. So it was a Saas organization. They were growing pretty quickly, hitting around 50 million in revenue. And their structure was they had a chief technology officer who was the leader for the security team, information security, and their product team. So they were running into operational issues where product was not able to set the direction of the organization in terms of what are we going to be putting out. A lot of the decisions were being driven from a technical standpoint and what the technical team wanted to do. So my argument was, and typically speaking, you don't see, when a company's in very early stage, you typically see technology and product merged under one leadership. But as you continue to grow, and especially if you have multiple product lines, and if you say you're a product-led organization, product has to be a function which is separate and working with the CEO so they can actually influence the direction of the product. So my argument to the CEO wasn't that, well, there's some issues going on, we need to separate them, because it's like, well, you're creating a new layer of the organization. I don't like that. That's more work for me, right? And what is going to change here? So I worked with that CTO, their head of product, and the CEO to articulate, okay, what are the things that we're doing well now? What are the things that are bottlenecking us? How are they impacting revenue by doing a financial analysis with finance? Because it was impacting the product launch dates. It was impacting the kind of features and capabilities of our products, right? Because those directly impact what customers want from the research data and revenue potential. So I laid out the pros and cons of these decisions from a revenue standpoint, and how does this impact your revenue growth, your bottom line, and your cash runway, because you're a startup. When they looked at it from that perspective, they're like, okay, we need to do this right now, because if we don't, we're going to lose X amount of market, revenue potential. So this is not an HR conversation, generally speaking. When you look at it from that lens, this is a very business focused conversation through an HR action item where you're restructuring the org. So that's kind of what I mean by you need to look at it from that lens, as opposed to just from an HR cocoon, which doesn't translate into growth, scalability, and so forth.
Yeah, HR cocoon, I think one of the first things, again, that comes to mind is compliance, labor laws. And as I think great HR people as well, and you know this better than I do, but it's a fine line. They balance it between the business and the people, and they take care of everything in between. And what you were saying right there is you're almost mediating, facilitating, and almost probably quarterbacking the conversation, which is awesome. Now, when I was learning more about you, I found another example that I thought was awesome, and it goes back to talking about like P&Ls and an example of work you did. Share with our listeners the one where you had that organization where they had an outsourced recruiter, and how that impacted how much they were spending over time, and the big difference, because right there, that's even tighter of where HR can help out.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I remember this example you're talking about. So this is a company that it's a technology company as well, and a fast growing one. They were growing at like 100% year over year in terms of revenue, and they were adding people like every month like crazy, and they weren't able to keep up with their own need for hiring. So they outsourced pretty much most of their hiring activity. What ended up happening is that the company was having issues with building any kind of pipeline without reliance on external sources. So they were completely incapacitated in actually being able to hire anyone without the help of a third-party recruiter. And when they came to me with this, the first thing I looked at is the entire operation, the infrastructure of hiring, and sort of how things were going on. There were a lot of things they weren't doing and they weren't putting out there, like how does the culture work? There was no employer branding to speak of. The website didn't even have a career page, and weren't even posting their jobs on their website, which is kind of interesting. They were completely relying on paid ads and external recruiter. Their spend was almost $1.2 million a year.
I'm just jumping in, but on recruiter fees.
Yes, this is exclusively recruiter fees. We're not talking anything else, right? So when I looked at that number, and the funny thing is that the recruiter fees, that number was not visible to the organization because from a finance perspective, they were working with different types of recruiters, the traditional third-party recruiters versus, online recruiters versus freelancers. So they didn't even have them under the same bucket. They were under different chart of account buckets, and they were seen as separate line items. So when I looked, the first one of the things I asked for is, give me all the financials for your people stuff, all of it, right? And I recategorized everything once I learned about every spend. And I'm like, when I went to the CEO and told him, hey, this is what you're spending on recruiting fees, his jaw dropped. He's like, what? I'm like, yes, this is what you guys are doing. So what we ended up doing is that, of course, you can't switch it off overnight because then you just can't hire anymore because there was no infrastructure in place. What I did with that organization is there was one of the recruiters who we were working with on a contractor basis who was really a superstar recruiter, had the highest close ratio, had the highest success rate. And I looked at metrics in terms of, okay, all these recruiters, who are they bringing in? How long are they staying? And how are they performing over time? Because I wanted to determine which recruiters are actually the ones I want to keep on board versus the ones which are just noise, right? We're just, they're getting us a lot of people, they don't last too long, or they're the wrong fit. So we sort of trimmed down the recruiting cost. In the first 6 months, it went down by like 20%, just because we identified the recruiters that were actually hitting the mark. Then we set an 18-month plan to build, and again, it might seem like a long time, but if you want to build a company that can generate talent pipeline, it doesn't happen overnight. You need to shore up your employer branding, you need to build your internal operations, you need the infrastructure for it, and you need to train managers and build an actual process. There's a lot of things that go into that. So the goal over 18 months was to drop external recruiting fees from 1.2 million to no more than 50K annually. So again, it was...
Oh, wait, stop.
Yes.
1.2 million to 50K.
Yes, that was the goal. So And it was a very ambitious goal, but I was very confident because of the numbers. I'm like, okay, this is what we can do, and this is what we can get from this. And we set on that path for that plan, and basically we actually beat that expectation because what ended up happening is that the company's operation went from relying on all these recruiters, right, and no one internally and no operation, to having just one full-time recruiter, right? So a single full-time recruiter and an ATS system and almost no reliance on recruiters. So after 18 months, that company used only one recruiter for one single hire because their internal recruiter was actually overloaded and like, what the hell, let's just hire one of our good recruiters to get someone in. So it actually went down from 1.2 million to external recruiter fees of around 35K. Now the entire recruitment operation with hiring a full-time person, right, and ATS and all that kind of stuff, was around 150 to 200K as annual spend. But again, that is a fraction of what they were doing. And the kicker there is that the velocity of recruitment was not impacted. So one thing we wanted to maintain is that the time to hire and the acceptance rate of offers, we wanted to keep where they were. So the time to fill with external recruiters was hovering between 35 to 45 days. After the 18 months, we drove it down to 28 days. And then the acceptance ratio of offers was above 90%. So they're all like industry leading kind of benchmarks for a company of that size with a very small operation. But most of it was driven really by understanding how the spending is happening, what the end result is from that spending. Because if you're spending 1.2 million and you're getting $5 million in value after that, I'm good with that. But if you're not, then we got to tweak some things. And that was a case of saving more than 90% without losing any quality or velocity, but actually improving on it.
Well, you should have that on your billboard in Dallas. There should be a billboard where you use that story. I mean, that's an incredible story, and I have a lot of different questions and different angles. But one thing that's important to me, especially as we're a live learning organization, is that you said that you've dug into people-related expenses throughout organizations, and we talked about some, a lot of mistakes people make. But for companies that grow and scale, what impact have you seen training have? And is there like any kind of ballpark on budget, you think, percentage of revenue that the company should be investing in their people through
Yeah,
training or coaching?
I love that question. Training and coaching is one of those things that unfortunately companies, especially in their growth stage, they're excited about, but as long as their growth starts slowing down or they hit a ceiling, it is one of the first things, if not the first thing, that gets chopped, generally speaking. Now, the issue I see with companies, generally speaking, is that, and you probably know this better than I do, is that isolating the impact of training on your organization is not a very easy task. It is doable, but it's not easy, right?
No, very hard.
It's very hard to do. So, and again, if you want to do it right, you need to do like, control groups and all that kind of stuff just to do all these different things. And again, with startups especially, there's so much going on and so many changes happening where it just makes the process a bit difficult. So what I've seen work, generally speaking, is organizations should have a percentage of their people spend. And the reason I say people spend is I'm not a big fan of distributing budget across every department for training and letting them do what they want with it, right? Because I've seen that fail miserably because it ends up being every department is doing their own thing, right? There's inconsistency in how training dollars are deployed. There's inequity sometimes in how it's deployed. Someone, the manager likes one person or the other, they send them to training where the others are just drowning with work. They don't get the opportunities. So with people, from the people expenses and people budget side of things, I typically say that, try to have anywhere from 1 to 3% of the budget, of the entire budget, just blocked for people development activities. And people development in my world would encompass, coaching, training, develop anything which helps the individual develop in their role, get ready for the next role, or, acquire a new skill or so forth. Now, how do I like deploying that specifically from my own perspective is any training and development also has to have alignment with what the company's trying to do. And training typically it has to be a win-win for both the individual and the organization. Whenever it's one at the expense of the other, I think training isn't usually effective, because if the employee is not enthusiastic about learning whatever you want them to learn, they're not going to acquire that knowledge and deploy it the way you would hope them to. On the other end, if you send someone to a training that has no identifiable benefit to the organization, right? Then the business is going to perceive learning as a spend that I can just drop at any time where I just don't think it's necessary anymore. So when you create that win-win dynamic where any training and development paths are very consciously developed and they are tailored in a way that they are aligned with where the business is trying to go. So let's take a practical example here. Let's say that I am a company. Let's say I'm a recruiter. I'm a recruiting company, right? Let's just take a random example here. So my recruiters today are used to LinkedIn Recruiter, the typical old school, get people on the phone, all that kind of thing. There's all these AI tools coming out today, right? And recruitment's one of those areas where AI is just flooding the market with hits and misses. But there's a certain skill set you need to have to leverage any of these tools and just make more hires. So for learning and development, it would be great for me as a recruiting organization to have a percentage of my spending allocated to shoring up the skills of my entire team on how to leverage, the core basics of AI prompting, some of the learning tools and so forth, to be able to start infusing that, but also putting in a reward system which actually rewards them for deploying that skill set on the job. So if learning is just staying in the classroom or, on a virtual seminar or so forth, and you aren't incentivizing someone to take that learning and apply it in the organization, you're also missing some opportunities. So, to summarize, yes, have a certain percentage, typically 1 to 3%. That's what I do, but again, it could differ based on every organization. Have very deliberate and well thought out learning initiatives that benefit both the employee, not only in your company, but could even help their career, but also be aligned with your company's trajectory, but also create a reward and incentive system where any learning which is deployed is celebrated and rewarded in the organization to incentivize the deployment of that knowledge and to keep the company moving forward.
So to kind of recap what you're saying right there is spend 1 to 3% on some type of employee development. You got to make it a win-win for both parties, both the business and the individual. And sometimes I feel like all the learning doesn't have to directly take place with what their job roles are. If it helps get them to learn how to have learning agility, but tying it back, and if you do it that way, make sure that the company knows that it's still benefiting them, right? Because it's benefiting them. They're feeling better about themselves. They feel like they have purpose. And I like the rewards. The other thing you said that's absolutely key is that you can't just sit in classes and seminar. You have to put it into action. One of my favorite quotes, a guy, David Katz, the CEO of Plastic Bank, said, "Learning without doing is treason," which I love that one. You got to put it into practice. I've heard you talk about this. I've talked about it a million times. Another area where training can have a big impact is one of the biggest mistakes people make, and I want you to talk about it a little bit, moving somebody from a high-performing individual contributor into a new manager.
I kind of had a feeling you were going to go there. So, yes, it is one of those things when you talk about it, it just makes so much sense. But in practice, you see it happen so many times. Individual contributors. So let's talk. What is a good individual contributor and what is managing? Because they're very different, right? An individual contributor is someone who is excellent at delivering on the expectations of a job that is well scoped out, that is clear, right? And they own the outcome of their own role point blank. They are not responsible or accountable for the work and development of other people. They are generally accountable for their own scope of work in their area of expertise and responsibility, and that's about it. It is a more narrow focus. When you're a people manager, you are responsible for that, plus that for others, not only yourself. But what does that mean? It means that not only do you need to make sure that there's some work that you need to get done gets fulfilled, you are also right now accountable for the work of others and their ability to deliver on that work, because you are essentially the person who is held accountable for their performance and their development and so forth. Those are very two different things, right? There is some overlap with the skill set when it comes to the technical side of things, but the whole people side and management of things is something which is pretty foreign to someone who has never done this before. And unfortunately, the expectation sometimes is that the best individual contributor is going to make the best manager or is the best person to manage. And that is incorrect. And that is just not me speculating here. There's a plethora of studies out there that prove this. But why does this happen? The best manager isn't usually, or sometimes, the best person from a technical standpoint, right? And why is that so? Because a lot of times when you move into a manager role and to a people development role, your focus is less on the day-to-day technical aspects of doing work. There's a big portion of it of actually managing the entire operation of your team, developing others, and working and coaching. But an individual contributor without the right development and training and being set up for success will more likely than not do a pretty poor job as a people manager, because the expectations are different. The skill set you need is very different. And although there is some overlap from a technical standpoint, they typically struggle from the other side of things where they just don't know what to do because they've never been in that situation. So I'm super opposed to the concept of, if you are the best individual contributor, you are the person who has to be the manager. And let's just throw you to the sharks and hope you can swim. Because more times than not, they really can't swim very well when you throw them with the sharks the first time. So yeah, I think there always should be a kind of ramp up. And when you're looking at who's the best person to potentially be a manager, the technical side of things isn't the only thing you should be looking at. You should be looking at their leadership capability, their ability to manage and influence others, their ability to coach and guide. Although you might not see them on full display in their current role, but typically there are signs of them in day-to-day work that you can pick up on and you can nurture and develop to get people ready to be set up for success when they actually go into that kind of role.
Do you have any questions or, I don't know, an assessment? Because the best way to do this is to catch it early on before you even move people into that role.
There's a few things you can do here. So there are a lot of assessments out there that can pick up things like this. There's the traditional ones, like the Hogan's assessments and all this
Right,
kind of
yeah.
stuff, right? And anything similar to them. Those are good to help you pick up on the general profile of the individual and how they work and where are their strengths and development areas that you can work on. I think they're very good for setting the baseline. Okay, where are we now? And what are the things we can get towards? In terms of questions and so forth, I don't think there isn't, like, I would say, a single blueprint. I think it's an ongoing process between the existing manager and whoever is the person who's going to be, quote unquote, eligible for promotion at some point, right? Because if you're doing your job well as a manager, you are interfacing with that individual on a regular basis. You're having your one-to-ones, you're having your development conversations, you're having your performance review conversations, all that kind of stuff. I think in those conversations is where you as a manager need to be able to pick up on the things they do well versus the things that they could be working on, and work and guide them throughout that journey without necessarily saying that, you know what, you're eligible for promotion in 2 years for a manager role. But as a manager, my job should be to afford that opportunity to any person on my team, right? And be able to actually help them grow in their careers, be it at the current organization they're in with us or others. It's something you need to do. It's part of your job. And something I like doing to make sure that happens is managers have to be held accountable for that. Like when you're running a performance review for a manager, you're not only running it based on their end outcome numbers, you're also looking for, you should be looking for their ability to manage people effectively, to be able to develop people professionally, personally, and so forth. Those are things that are a core part of what a manager does. So yeah, I don't think it's just a set of questions and so forth. I think it's an ongoing interaction and observation of their work versus where they need to get to or where you envision them getting to, but also involving them in the process, because this isn't a one-way street. You need to also understand from the employee's perspective what are the things that they want to be doing, because I can't tell you how many times I have interfaced with people who are amazing individual contributors who had zero interest in managing anyone ever. Um, like, you know what? I want to keep doing what I'm doing. I don't care if I make less money. I don't care about any of this. I don't want to deal with people problems. It's not for me. I'm not interested in it. I want to do this stuff, and this is what I'm great at. And I want to be the best at this. So don't talk to me about this promotion to manager stuff, right? I'm not interested. And sometimes people have a hard time articulating, thinking, and making sense of that. But it's also something to take into account. So that's why you need the other party's input as well in molding that coaching and mentoring relationship and see which path is the best for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think two of the most critical things you said is it's not a one-off assessment. I'm glad I totally agree with you. It's an ongoing process as you're managing these people anyways, right? And you're coaching to see them. And two, just ask. A lot of times they don't ask. Last thing I want to do, I want to kind of close out on the learning part. Just a statement is now from getting to know you, and you're saying that HR getting a seat at the table, looking at P&Ls, and being more strategic. I believe the HR people, if they take that approach, when they go into the CFO and ask for budgets for training and learning and coaching, they'll be taken more seriously and get approved because it'll be looked at as more strategic, even if you don't have the tangible ROI that can be tied into it. So I think that that's a great point right there. Get started early and be a strategic partner from HR. Earlier on, Nahed, we talked about you want to grow, hire more people. That may very well in the next 6 months be the old school way of thinking because of AI. Because of AI. So my first question to you is, what does AI ready mean from an HR perspective?
I love that question. AI ready, if you ask 10 different people, you'll probably hear 10 different answers today. And AI is in its nascent stages, right? It's very early on. I think anyone who says right now that AI is going to be this in 5 years or 10 years doesn't know what they're talking about, because in 6 months from now, this whole thing, like AI's capabilities are improving so quickly in a manner that is very hard to comprehend. I don't think we've ever seen in our lifetimes, or even, forefathers before us, like throughout history, anything which has developed at this scale, at this pace very quickly. I mean, AI has only been around like effectively between our hands for the past, 2.5, 3 years. And the amount of development it's gone through is just mind blowing. But to answer your question, AI ready, I think means a few things. First off, there has to be an organization alignment on what does AI mean for us. And what do I mean by that? Because AI, if you want to look at it from like the macro level, there's two conversations happening around AI. One is AI going to replace jobs completely, or is AI going to augment and complement jobs? Those, I would say, are the two biggest arguments happening now. And there's different spectrums to them, right? There's people who give you the scenario of Skynet and Terminator where they're going to take over the world. And there's others where you're going to say like, hey, this is never going to be able to take over a full cognitive knowledge based role. It's going to be a great complement and augmentation for people to do more with less. So when you look at it from that perspective, as an organization, you need to decide, okay, where are we on this spectrum and how do we actually want to approach AI? There's people who are trying to approach AI from the perspective, and I've heard a lot of CEOs say this over the past couple of months, and founders, is they are not willing to hire or fill a job before their team can prove that an AI can't do it with a respectable amount of output. So I don't think that is the right approach. And the reason I'm saying that is that I think AI today, the jobs it can do and where it can succeed is if you give it very clear black or white inputs where you're expecting it to spit out output, which is very narrow in scope, it does a pretty good job. So I'll give you an example here. If you're trying to write a time off policy for the state of New York and the state of California, there are very clear and concise documented laws for what should go into a time off policy for each of those states. AI for that use case is brilliant because it is dealing with a very specific set of inputs, right? They're very black and white, they're very clear. Room for interpretation is almost zero. It takes that input, it can crunch that analysis and data in seconds, right? And spit out for you output, which a human will take days to do, they can do in a matter of minutes. That is great. The moment you start to asking AI to quote unquote think and analyze and interpret many different inputs, and especially if you don't have all the inputs you need to make a decision, things start going off the rails a little bit. So if you give, and I've experimented with this a lot with startups, even myself, is when you throw too much at AI and throw too many considerations, too many inputs, too many questions at the same time, you will start noticing some chinks in the armor. Well, it starts hallucinating, it doesn't give you everything you need, it sometimes misses something, it misinterprets something, and so forth. So where I think AI ready means is that, first of all, determine where you are on the spectrum. I usually advise folks to say, think of what are the things that you don't want your people doing and things that people don't do very well. Sort of the things which are repetitive, which have very clear inputs, outputs. They're not cognitively taxing and so forth. Because people, where do they shine? They shine in the cognitive heavy, strategic, artistic, creative type of work, right? And making decisions without having all the inputs the computer needs to make a decision, generally speaking. So AI, I think, to be AI ready is determining within your and your value chain, meaning what are the steps that you go through to go from zero to actually creating value to customers? Which parts of this process can you deliver to a machine to do and do it actually better and more efficiently, so your people can focus on doing more of the work that they are good at and that a machine can't do yet, right? Who knows what a guy is going to be able to do in 5 to 10 years, right? I might be out of a job, right? But being AI ready for me is being clear on what do you want to do as an organization? What are you trying to solve for with AI? Are you trying to solve for efficiency? Are you trying to solve for capacity? Are you trying to replace or eliminate complete roles with AI? Make a decision on where you are on the spectrum, because there needs to be a purpose to how you're trying to deploy AI. And then set an organization-wide framework and strategic goal for how you deploy that. Because AI in one part of the business and not the other isn't really a great implementation, because you're only going to be as good as your weakest link. If you're automating something in one area, but then it has to be dumped to another area which doesn't do the same, then you're not doing things the right way. So for me, yeah, set your purpose, make it an organization-wide mandate, and start deploying it, but also be ready to toss it all out the door and change it because of the pace of change that's happening in the world with AI and so forth.
I think that's great advice. And I also think, tied back to AI, I think it's important for leaders and founders and managers of all levels to be as transparent as possible with your organization on your goals for that, because so many people worry about, are they going to be out of a job or not? So I think that's part of your responsibility. We need to wrap up here. This has been awesome. Do you have one quick tip that you want to leave with for a founder or a leader when it ties back to increasing the impact out of your HR, whether it's somebody who's fractional or in-house, or what they could do better or different?
Yeah, definitely. I think the main thing I usually say to founders, if I want to leave them with only one thing, is think of HR as the infrastructure for your organization. It is an enabler of your organization. HR is not a magic pill. It is the infrastructure and the scaffolding for your entire company, because your company is built on people, and people drive value and drive the organization forward. If you have a weak foundation, then the whole structure is going to crumble on your head. Build a solid foundation. Think of the people side of things early on. It doesn't mean you need to go out and hire an HR leader from the start. Start having conversations with people who understand that world, right? Take their advice and start understanding what are some of the building blocks you need to have in place at different stages of your growth, because that also looks different from, from 50 employees to 100 to 500 plus. So start building the scaffolding, start talking to people who understand that world, because at the end of the day, it will help your company grow, and it will be what I call the rocket fuel of your growth. And that's kind of how I like to leave it.
Rocket fuel growth. I love it. Where can our listeners connect with you?
Yeah, so there's two ways you can connect with me. I'm on LinkedIn, so easy to connect there. Feel free to drop me a message. Happy to engage with anyone. Also, you can visit the website organizedchaos.fyi. That is the website for my podcast, newsletter services, and all that stuff. So if anyone's interested in learning more about, my thought process around scaling and growing with HR, that I would say is the best place to be.
Awesome. This has been great. Listeners, I want to leave you with an assignment. If you're a founder, I want you to think about how you can get more impact out of your HR team. If you're an HR person, change the lens of your thinking, get your business acumen in there and work for a seat at the table. And if you know somebody who's an HR person who could benefit from this, please send this episode to them. Nahed, you've been awesome. And I want to say to everybody, stay curious, keep learning. Have a great day. See you next time.
We would go through tryouts, and I would have my team together. I would tell them that, hey, we're going to have some major adversity this year. I don't know when it's going to happen, but it is.